Welcome anyone who's watching online to Intro to Kabbalah. This is actually our morning class called User's Guide to the Soul. We just had a small technical glitch with the first 15 minutes of the class you're going to watch. So we're reteaching that and learning it with this group, and then we'll transition to the evening class. So everything should make sense as you're watching. Thanks, Maya. And we're going to be using Laibl Wolf's text, Practical Kabbalah, which is available anywhere. Practical Kabbalah by Rabbi Laibl Wolf. We'll be following through that. So if you're watching at home, good idea to get a copy of this book, and we'll announce the pages as we introduce readings. And let me say, even if you're out there, I look forward to learning from each person that I sit down with to learn, including yourselves. As Laibl often says, I've heard myself talk about this quite a bit, in my case, even when no one else is around. So feel free to email in questions. If you're going to start watching live, you can text in questions as we're recording and be part of the class. And I'm looking forward to learning from you. Before we start getting into Kabbalah, let's look at the structure of the soul and mind, body, and soul, and what those definitions are. And for those here, why don't you grab one of these so you can follow as we go along. So if you pull up, please, that first slide, Adam. This is a model of who we actually are from a Kabbalistic perspective. Right, this is from Practical Kabbalah, page 36. And this shows you sort of a diagram of what the soul is. Often in the West, we think of the soul as a single point of light within, or as a uniform glowing ball of light or something along those lines. In Judaism, the soul is quite a complex being, a complex living organism. And here's a basic structure of what it is. The soul is an umbilical cord flowing from the bottom of this diagram, space, time, and consciousness, so this world where we are, flowing upward through 4 spiritual worlds until finally it flows out of what we call the Ein Sof, which simply means infinite, without end. So in Kabbalah, Ein Sof is the term most often used for God. We'll mostly stick with that. Sorry, if we need to share, can we pass a few around? I apologize if there aren't enough. Thank you. Oh, you've got it. Good. Beautiful. So the soul is like an umbilical cord flowing from life, from the here and now, up through these 4 spiritual worlds until it flows out of the Ein Sof. And we can see the 4 spiritual worlds. Perhaps we'll get into them a little more detail in a later class. If there were this infinite light, or in fact this infinity, it's not even a light yet, but it emits an infinite light, and that light would be impossible for us to use because if we encountered it, we would be nullified like the flame of a candle within the sphere of the sun. A tiny candle flame in a dark room may have reality, but put it into the center of the sphere of the sun, there's really no candle flame there, it's just sun. So we can't use that light, it's too bright. So in order to dim it, the Ein Sof created a huge barrier where none of the light gets through whatsoever, like a shade on a lamp. And yet, even though none of the light gets through, there's an impression on the other side and more light comes through, which unfortunately is still infinite light that we can't use. Right? So even this world of Atzilus is still too bright, we would have no being. So another barrier, another shade is put on, and finally another, until finally we get down to this world where there's almost no spiritual light. And now we can actually see, move around, and we can use that light as beings. So to get back to the definition, the soul is a spiritual umbilical cord flowing from our reality up through these spiritual worlds, emerging out of the Ein Sof. And just to clarify, spiritual worlds are not sci-fi, other dimensional, different realities where different things are happening. It's the same world moving upwards with the same beings, however, it's much more subtle, much more energetic and spiritual.
In Yiddish, Ein Sof means one secret.
A sod is secret, sod, yeah? So yeah, and ein it means one in Yiddish, that's correct, but in Hebrew, ein means without, and sof means end. So it's a Hebrew term, yeah? But
meaning what?
Infinite, without end.
Oh.
But there may be some nice Hasidus in that. Well, I'll have to check if that's the case. That sounds beautiful. Now, what is the body? the soul is a very spiritual creature, has a lot of trouble picking up this pen, has a lot of trouble speaking with a physical mouth, has a lot of trouble walking around, eating food. The soul's not used to physical reality. It needs some kind of a vehicle to navigate all that. That vehicle, which we perhaps call the spacesuit of the soul, is the body. So when you look at your body, what is it? That's the vehicle by which your soul, this spiritual being, navigates time and space and even consciousness. Physical brain thinking physical thoughts. That's the body's role, and the soul can only think physical thoughts through the medium of the body. And finally, what's mind? We'll define that very simply. As the soul flows through the body, mind is the byproduct of the soul flowing through the brain. So soul flows through physical brain, byproduct, mind. Those are our three terms we'll use in these 5 classes as we go through the basics of Kabbalah: soul, mind, and body. And usually when I get to this point, people realize it's a whole new language, new terms that we're trying to adapt. There's an anecdote about a fellow from Poland who spoke mostly Yiddish and Polish, and he came to America and he was taking an English class, and the teacher said, "Can somebody please spell the word cultivate?" And he raised his hand, very proudly spelled it correctly, and then the teacher said, "Good, now can use it in a sentence." And he said, "Of course, I was waiting at the bus stop, but it was too cultivate, so I went back inside." Yeah, there's your Yiddish, right? I actually got a snort on the original document, right from my friend, right?
And the teacher gave him an A.
There you go. So what is Kabbalah? And from people in this room who've been learning, how would you define Kabbalah primarily? What does Kabbalah mean? Very good. So the mystical information of Judaism. And the word itself, Kabbalah, means what? Receiving. Lekabel, to receive. So Kabbalah primarily is spoken about as a means of receiving that mystical information. And that's very much how it functions. Something was transmitted at Sinai beyond the text of the Torah. There was something, say, above that text that couldn't be put into words. And that was transmitted to Moshe, who taught it to a circle of people, and throughout history it's been received and transmitted from teacher to student. Not something you can really explain consciously, but somehow you can still receive it and transmit it to students later on, and it arrives down to us. And let me say, first of all, I probably no one in this room thinks of themselves as a Makubal. Myself also. I think of myself as a student of Kabbalah, not as a Kabbalist. But even for people like us, who are just learning the basics, it is something you still can receive at your level, whatever that is, and transmit in whatever way to the people in your environment.
When do you earn the title of Kabbalist?
Kabbalist, that's a very rare breed. So these are people that are at a very lofty level in terms of learning and personality, refinement, and then there's a certain gift that I'm told comes where they receive a flow of something, and I don't know what that's about. For me, I'm just a normal guy trying to learn, but we're told each one of us can still receive something of the flow and still teach it in our manner to the people in our environment, even if we're not Kabbalists. So big disclaimer there.
Do you know one?
I've encountered a few people that are said to be Kabbalists. I don't have an antenna for that, so I just take their word for it. So yes, on the one hand, it is a transmission of a mystical tradition that was hidden, and for various reasons now is much more acceptable and accessible, and people like us can get together and learn it in all kinds of languages, wherever you want. There's resources everywhere, and you can look up and see why it is in history that, in particular now, new expressions of Kabbalah have emerged that are much easier for someone to learn who doesn't know Aramaic fluently, who doesn't learn 18 hours a day, who isn't necessarily a man, etc., etc. But now it's a tool for all of us, and let's dive in. But the second definition of Kabbalah is a little more counterintuitive. And to see that, let's look at how the word, or the root, is used in the Torah. In fact, the only time in the 5 books of Moses that the root for Kabbalah is used in the Torah. And that is in Exodus 26:5, and the term is makbilot halulaot, right? The loops are corresponding. So what's happening? We're building the Mishkan, we're building the tabernacle, and there's these curtains, these drapes, rather, that are on the outside, and they have to be attached together. So here's the instructions. Make 50 loops on the end of one, 50 on the end of the other, and the loops should be corresponding each to her sister, is actually the word it uses. It's a feminine. And then attach them together. So this word corresponding, one corresponding to the other, has something to do with Kabbalah as well. Because when we use a root in the Torah, it's always connected. In Hebrew, words are very defined, and any root, all its meanings branch out of one point. It's not like English, where words can have different connotations that are unrelated because of poetry, etc. So how is Kabbalah like correspondence, right? How does that work? The point is, we're trying to get at realities above consciousness. Right? So here I am, I'm in consciousness, I have my thoughts, I have my emotions, I'm trying to get at realities above consciousness, and I can't. I can only imagine things that have space, time, and consciousness elements. I can't visualize things that don't have space, time, consciousness elements. Give it a shot, right? Imagine the Ein Sof. Okay, I'm seeing light in space. That's what I'm seeing. Obviously, that's not the Ein Sof. Right? So imagination can try and create visualizations, and that can be useful. But keep in mind, all of our visualizations are still within time, space, and consciousness. That's how we're built. So how do we get above time, space, and consciousness to even the first spiritual aspect of Asiya and start to get some conscious understanding of spirituality? The way we do it in Kabbalah is to create correspondences. Correspondences. So we find a model within consciousness. We look at the relationship between the parts of the model. How do they fit together? How does it work? And then we recognize that that model in the physical reality is flowing out of a model in spiritual reality. Now, why is that? That's because that's the Kabbalistic vision of the world to begin with. Physical world does not exist independently. Physical world is flowing out of spiritual world, and spiritual world is creating physical world. Well, actually, Ein Sof is creating physical world and spiritual world, but the physical flows out of the spiritual, put it that way. So everything in the physical has its form and structure because it mirrors its spiritual source. That's why the physical body is so complex, because the soul is so complex. So whenever you're looking at some physical model, you're seeing a map of the spiritual model, and by understanding the components of the physical model and making a corresponding model, we can start to get an inner sense of what's happening in the spiritual. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you going with this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for instance, we've talked about light many times in this class. Let's look at light as a physical model for how we can understand the Or Ein Sof, spiritual light of some kind, of any kind. Right? So just popcorn out and think at home, what are qualities of light? What effect does light have on me? What are aspects of light that you might just consider? Anything. Light does what? Makes you feel what? Is what?
Feels warm.
Warm. Good. Makes you feel good and warm, right?
Brightness in the world.
Brightness in the world. And brightness does what?
Go away.
Makes darkness go away. Very nice.
Permits me to read.
Permits me to read. Permits me to see things. Right. So all these issues, how physical light makes us feel, so does spiritual light make us feel spiritually elevated. Right? It permits us to observe things that otherwise were in the dark. Also, spiritual light lets us observe spiritual aspects, internal aspects that otherwise would be in the dark. And in fact, as you said, the light chases away darkness instantly, so does spiritual light then make spiritual darkness vanish, and we recognize, like in Hanukkah, that the darkness was just the absence of light. Let's not go deep into that. Add some other things. Physical light, we know, is always attached to a luminary. If I see a beam of light coming through the window, I don't think it has its own existence. I know there's a luminary, the sun. If the luminary goes, the beam of light goes. Same thing with spiritual light. Spiritual light comes from the Ein Sof. If there's something called spiritual light, there must be a luminary. It also seems to travel physical light through space almost instantly. So does spiritual light travel through, quote-unquote, spiritual space almost instantly. Right? A great, lofty spiritual being can connect with a very lowly spiritual being, even though there's a great distance, instantly through this thing, spiritual light. So just to give you a taste, we're looking at the components of the physical model of light, and now trying to leap over that gap into the superconscious and say, okay, there's something called spiritual reality that has the same components, and I'm starting to understand something about its spiritual reality by using a corresponding model. That's a primary tool of Kabbalah, and you'll see we'll use it very often in this class as we come back to it.
Does the idea of connection also go along with that, the idea of correspondences, because those loops are there for the purpose of connection?
Yeah, the question is connection part of that concept?
Yeah.
Because the loops are corresponding, so they connect. I would think intuitively yes. I mean, I haven't read someone about that, but I would think intuitively yes. The whole point of the whole structure of the world is for us to recognize the Ein Sof and connect to it. So no doubt, the only reason that there are these correspondences is for us to be able to connect to the Ein Sof. So I like that very much, another level. Yeah, and two little points that I will touch on in the video shortly. One is well, we're going to define the sefirot. Okay, so let's look at the next page. Called the human metaphor of the sefirot. These are the building blocks, the basic literature of Kabbalah, the basic pieces of Kabbalah. And what you see here is called the tree of life, Eitz Chaim. They're called the sefirot. And if you're looking at them, you might mistake them for something studied in the East, which is chakras, right? The phenomenon of chakras. And people often see a map like this with the human body and the sefirot placed on them, and they think, oh, these are the Jewish version of the chakras. Mm-hmm. Where our class starts, the evening class, I'll be explaining that they have nothing to do with chakras. So they're a different phenomenon entirely. But just to introduce them, these are 10 sefirot. The word is hard to define, and we'll define it in 3 ways in just a moment. But they're 10 emanations flowing out of the Ein Sof that flow through all levels of existence, through our whole soul, down from the top to the bottom. And one thing I'll mention later, there's 2 main categories of the sefirot. There is the intellectual, which are the 3 on top, leaving out keter, chokhmah, bin, and dat. That's called seichel. Those are our intellectual sefirot. And then there's 7 on the bottom, which are emotional and behavioral. That's the main distinction, main grouping, seichel and emotional, intellectual and emotional. And one other little confusion is that on the one hand, we talk about the sefirot in terms of what comes from the Ein Sof and what flows through the cosmos, and those are the sefirot proper. We also talk about the sefirot as something within us in our literature. There you might use the word powers, kochot, attributes, or sometimes even midot, right? Midot mainly is the emotional attributes are called midot. But the way the sefirot flow within me, that's my attributes, my internal powers, my kochot, or my midot emotionally. The way they flow in the cosmos, that's always called the sefirot. But sometimes you'll hear sefirot discussed about my internal state. And so here I'm going to get back to our regular class, and online you'll be joining the evening class. I hope that you'll join us for the rest of the 5, and feel free to be in touch with questions, and I wish you an amazing journey of learning. Thank you. But let me just put out there, one thing these aren't, even though it looks like it, these aren't the Jewish chakras. And not only are they not the Jewish chakras, they're completely nothing like a chakra. They're a completely other phenomenon. And the reason there's that confusion is sometimes we see it drawn like this on a human body, with showing the right arm is chesed, the left arm is gevura, etc. And so we look at it, we say, oh, that looks like the chakras. There must be some energy point here that's chesed, some energy point here that's gevura. This chokhmah is somewhere a point on this, and if I meditate, I'll experience an energy vortex there, etc., etc. There are contact points in Kabbalah. 15 contact points that run down the center of the body are primarily used. That's another topic. That's not what these are. These are not physical points on the body. The only reason it's sometimes drawn on a body is because the body is one possible metaphor for the 10 sefirot. It can also be drawn as a series of concentric circles, right? Or you could draw a chandelier if you want. You could draw a caterpillar. I don't care. Because this is all above time and space. So when you're above time and space, there isn't a right side and there isn't a left side. There isn't an up for the head to be above the torso. There isn't a down for the feet to be below the torso. So any model you see, keep in mind, it has nothing to do with the model. And the model almost doesn't matter at all. It's just trying to give us a sense that this can use the human body as a metaphor to express itself. That's a little tricky. So say, imagine, take a trip with me into Aesop's fables. And say we were all in the story of the tortoise and the hare. Right, here we are, and we live in a world that Aesop wrote. And why did Aesop write this world? What was the moral that he wanted to teach? What's the moral of the tortoise and the hare? Thank you. Slow and steady wins the race. Joey, how you doing? Have a seat. Right, so we are here in Aesop's fables, and this whole world was created to teach slow and steady wins the race. And there's a story happening in the world that's really the central organizing story. It's got a tortoise. The tortoise represents what? Slow and steady. The hare represents what? Fast and careless. The race represents what? Life. Okay. Now the prophet of our world comes down and says, this world was created by Aesop. He's the author of this world. And the whole reason for your existence is slow and steady wins the race. We say, I don't get it. You're crazy. Let me draw you a diagram, he says. Here's the hare, here's the tortoise, here's the race. The hare is fast and careless, the tortoise is slow and steady, the race is the life. Now you have a diagram. Now do you understand? This whole race is a metaphor for a lesson that Aesop is trying to teach us. And we look at the map and we say, oh, okay, so the hare is speed, and that point on the hare that you're pointing to is actually where the speed is. And the tortoise is slow and steady, and here on the tortoise's shell there's a point that's slow and steady, and the racetrack is, and somewhere there's a contact point on the road, and the prophet says, no, it's not that at all. The whole thing is the metaphor. The whole story. The hare itself is a metaphor for this idea, an abstract idea. There's no point on the hare. It's just Aesop is telling us a story, and these are all metaphors. Now come back to our world. Kabbalah says this world has an author. That author is trying to communicate something to us, right? Things like you're all a part of something, a oneness, right? You should be kind to each other, don't steal, these kind of things. And there's all these metaphors that are being painted around us. One of the primary metaphors is our physical body. So the sefirot created the physical body as it is as a metaphor to explain something to us, not because there's some point on my right arm that's chokhmah, that's chesed, but because the metaphors are always trying to express and explain something to us. And you could find many, many correspondences from the 10 Commandments to the 10 statements God made creating the world, to, we'll look at some of the divine names, almost anything. You can look and see how it is a metaphor flowing out of the 10 sefirot. So that's why you'll often see this, but it's not contact points on a body. It's just the body itself is a metaphor. So I'm going to use, instead of this chakra idea, let's use the 3 definitions, or the 3 meanings of the root of sefirot to try and get a handle on what sefirot are. Perfect. So the first word that flows out of that root is sapir, which means sapphire. Sapphire. Right? So there's many visions the prophets had of, so this isn't, we're still on this page. On this page. I turned my notes page, I didn't turn my, So many of the prophets saw these beautiful gleaming emanations. They describe them as perhaps a block of sapphire, as flowing out of the Ein Sof. This is something that a prophet might see, and we can't really understand what they're seeing, but they describe it as something like sapir, an emanation. That's the way that the sefirot function, as emanations from the Ein Sof. Right at the top of our worlds, something flows out, 10 elements flow out, completely united with the Ein Sof, but each one of them has an aspect of brilliance. So in the world, in the level of Ein Sof, the 10 sefirot are flowing out as emanations, right? The second definition comes from sefer or sipur, story. Right? Just like Aesop's fables, we're living in something that sort of represents a story. We each have a sense of being something like a character in that story. We're a main character in our own story. We're a supporting character in someone else's story. We're an incidental character in somebody else's story. And the whole thing flows like a narrative through time. And the sefirot also function in our consciousness, kind of like the author of a story, putting a story together. They create our sense of having a constant flow of consciousness and identity and choices to make, etc., with emotions, with intellect, with words, with speech. All that is flowing also out of the sefirot. So that's a second level. On the level of Ein Sof, they function as emanations, sapir. On the level of consciousness, they function as sipur, or sefer, a story, a narrative. And the third dimension of them is from the mispar, number, all from the same root. And mispar is more, if you're a fan of the Matrix, remember the Matrix series? The famous, flowing back and so they realize the whole world is just sort of a grid on some kind of a server, and that server has a program. If you can figure out the program, you can do all kinds of fun tricks. Not saying you can, but yes, the world itself and how the world is created at every moment, because in Kabbalah we see the world as being created constantly, not just in Bereshit, and being projected from this spiritual light onto a screen of time and space and consciousness. And the way that's happening is out of a matrix that is, again, the 10 sefirot. So that's how they function in terms of creation, in terms of the world. So 3 levels. 1 is the Ein Sof, and they function as emanations. 2 is my consciousness, and they function as a book or a story. 3 is the world itself, and they function as a matrix out of which the physical world and the spiritual worlds all emerge. Ken?
Digit is sifra.
Sifra. Very nice, yeah.
It sounds even closer to sifra.
That's nice. Yeah, digit is sefira. Sifra. I like that. Thanks. So usually when I finish this, it's very quiet in the room. It's kind of like what happens in a pharmacy when they have very, very slow business. You can hear a cough drop. No snort. That's okay. Sorry. The first class is the most abstract, and then we'll start get to some things that I understand even as I'm saying them. One more detail about the sefirot. You'll often hear the word sphira used for the sefirot as they are coming out of the divine, out of the Ein Sof, and also for how I experience them in my own consciousness, right? So we'll learn about chokhmah in a moment. Chokhmah is that spark of intellect. I experience that all the time. I realize things all the time. That's not the same as God's chokhmah. There's obviously a difference between our chokhmah and God's chokhmah. So the way that they express in our consciousness, there's another word for that, midot, or attributes. Right? So we're talking about them on several levels. The way the sefirot flow in the whole cosmos, that's the sefirot of the world. The way I experience them in my own consciousness, those are my attributes, the midot. And the beauty is my attributes flow out of the cosmic sefirot. So it's something like an old-fashioned holograph. Remember the holographs in the museum? These like 3D kind of screens. If you break them in 2, what do you see in each screen? Same picture, right? Just a little bit fuzzy in each picture, but it's not 2 halves. You get the same picture in each screen. Break it again, now you get 4 pictures. Keep breaking it till you get tiny crumbs. Each one still has the whole picture, but very, very blurry. You can barely see what it is. Same thing with us. The attributes, as they express within me, they flow out of the cosmic attributes, except by the time you get to my little crumb of it, it's very blurry. I'm looking at it. I'm looking directly at the cosmic attributes. I'm seeing the whole picture, but I'm actually seeing it's very difficult to decipher what it is from my perspective. Of course, many of us coming together, the picture gets a little bit clearer, doesn't it? And finally, the whole community, all of Judaism together, and then the whole world together, it becomes clear. That's why oneness is so key. We all have a piece to fit back into this picture. Yep. So let's move to the first of our sefirot, Chokhmah. And we have this beautiful, I love this. Here, Janelle, can we put up Monsieur Chokhmah? Usually it's written without the Vav, but my assistant Maya, thank you Maya, she likes to fill it in modern Hebrew. It's often spelt with the Vav. But this is the first of the sefirot, Chokhmah. Here our picture, we have a gentleman and he's sort of thinking of something. And there's this one flash of light there in the middle. Right? There's this one spark that's there on its own. And looking at it, you'd think, You're really just there for a moment and then it vanishes and something else takes its place, right? Have you ever had that experience where you were thinking deeply about something, where you were trying to work out a problem, where you were encountering a new situation, and suddenly, now you know what it's about. Now you realize what's the deepest interpretation here for you. At that moment, at that exact moment that you realize the solution or the interpretation, not a half a second later, but at that moment, did you understand anything about the solution or the insight? Think back to the moment you solved a problem when you were in the shower and, oh, I got it. I know I got it. I have no idea what it is. If you look at the exact moment, there's a flash that's like a spark that emerges out of a void, but it's incomprehensible. We don't know what it is. It's hidden from us, but we know it's emerged as a spark. That is how Chokhmah appears in our consciousness. That's also how Chokhmah appears in the cosmos. So let's go to Laibel's text. I like how he expresses it because he really brings it into the relational. Yes?
I have this picture behind the light. There's a whole bunch of things going on.
I know. I didn't design the picture. I just found the picture. So those I have nothing to say about those things. That was just the art. If I could have found one without them, I would have used that. So yeah, that's just Adobe art. It's a pretty introduction. But look at the spark itself. That's kind of like in this empty space. That's what I had in mind. Yeah.
It's when you go to the kitchen and you stop because I don't remember what I'm looking for. And then it hits me.
Yeah, but that's actually dot. We'll get to that. That's dot. You already knew what you're looking for. So the Chokhmah spark was there previously. Dot disconnected from it and you forgot, and then you dot reconnected to it. Yeah, but yes. Okay, so what I like to do is perhaps if we read a paragraph and discuss when we start here and then pass it on when we're done. Think of yourself.
Think of yourself as a deep pond fed by the gushing waterfall of the Sefirot. You are also the one who fishes in that pond. Your natural disposition can be likened to a fishing reel. Your deeper wants and wishes are the bait. The way you pursue joy and alleviate pain is represented by the area of the lake where you prefer to fish. Your thoughts are the fish you catch. Most of us fish in exactly the same way, in exactly the same area of the pond, and we always catch the same fish. In general, we respond in the same way to the same stimuli.
Is this familiar to people? We're creatures of habit. I see someone, and immediately I have a set of reactions that's there ready. Right? Oh, I love this person. I have such a good time. I'm so happy to see them, right? Automatic. Oh, this person, they always grate on me. They always say this and that. I'm going to have a terrible time. I hope it's over as soon as possible, right? They haven't opened their mouth, right? Maybe they're doing something completely different today, but no, I'm ready, right? My fishing rod's ready. I'm in that little mud spot in the pond. I'm ready to catch my tadpole, right? And also places, right? Oh, my wife wants to go to this restaurant. I hate it. It's always too loud. I'm going to have a bad time, and I'm grumpy heading out the door. The way that we project and interpret any situation or any information is unique. And if you think about it, we have the possibility to reframe it in any way. There's infinite ways of interpreting any set of facts or any situation. And we each have our characteristic way of doing that. And our way of doing that, that's how we fish for the Chokhmah spark. That's our style of sourcing Chokhmah. Right? And once it comes in, now the rest of consciousness flows out of that. How we interpret reality determines everything else. Let's go on. Scientists?
If we persist in interpreting an event in the same negative way, hurtful and fear-laden, then our brain will persist in delivering its characteristic load of excessive stress, releasing hormones that trigger a chain reaction of biochemical events. And
by the way, if you're on the video, we're on pages 68 and 69 of Laibel's book, Practical Kabbalah, so feel free to follow with us. So for many of us, life involves a lot of stress. We've had negative experiences that are stored up in our memory, and Chokhmah is always looking to connect a new experience with that past stressful experience. And if that's the way we interpret reality, as a chain of recurring stressful events, then it's going to be difficult as well on our physical being. We know about that because we live in a very stressful time, right? Running around, working, dealing with media, dealing with traffic. We live in a more stressful time than if you just had a house and had a farm and went back and forth. Right? So learning how to fish differently for Chokhmah is a very, very important skill for the time our souls are now living in. Scientists?
Scientists have verified that the body's memory of fear is the emotion most deeply recorded in the brain's memory banks. For instance, if you remember a traumatic job interview in which the interviewer tried to discredit and demean you, that memory will become part of the recorded information your brain relays to your body every time you enter an interview room. Just thinking about it, you may find that your palms grow sweaty, your face flushes with discomfort, and your heart beats uncomfortably loud in your chest.
Right? And we all have our version of that, some past situation that every time we now encounter it, there seems to be some automatic chokhmah spark that is stressful, that has fear involved in it. Is that necessary? Right? Might we do better fishing from a completely other part of the pond? And what would happen if we did? Because we don't know what the future holds. It's always uncertain. So why not assume that it's going to be something positive? Right? If I assume it'll be something negative, I may be adding to that pattern. If I assume it's something positive, A, I'll be higher functioning, B, I'll have more fun, and C, I'll be contributing to that possibility anyways. Because in Kabbalah, we say your thoughts do affect the world around you, subtly, right? But actually, even though it's subtle. So when I put out a certain wavelength, everyone in my sphere of influence, in a subtle way, receives that. That's why we like being around people that are happy and optimistic. There's certain people you just are gravitate towards, not because, right, you just get something from them that you like. So each of us, we affect the people around us, we affect systems. So if it's 50-50 and their interview might go positive or negative, why not project positive? I see no reason to project otherwise. And yet, we often do. Let's go on.
Is it possible to reinterpret consciously negative circumstances as positive outcomes? Like living in denial invite its own dangers? The truth is that very little in life is categorically positive or negative. Most of the circumstances we face, even the seemingly insurmountable obstacles, are the product of subjective interpretations. Can we really know that the business deal we lost might not prove to be a stepping stone to an even better one? Are we in a position to determine whether being spurned by a love interest might not eventually lead to permanent joy and happiness with another? Is it possible that an illness might not prove to be the very trial that strengthens our resolve in another area of our life?
Right. When I was finishing up a cantorial program I was in, I love you guys at Bethel. I wish you all the best. I saw an ad for Bethel, but I hadn't gotten to the end of my cantorial program. I couldn't apply for it. It was such a horrible thing. I was so stressed. It was perfect. It was close to Toronto. It was close to family. When was another Detroit synagogue ever going to open up again? It was a nice big synagogue. It had a big musical tradition. Amazing. It was the worst thing in the world. Finally, they found somebody and they went out of placement before I could apply. Worst thing in the world, right? Or not? Because when I finally got to the end of placement, suddenly Temple Israel came into placement. Same city, same place. I will say a much better fit for me, and voila, I'm here, right? So I could have interpreted that first lost possibility as a closed door, as a life-ruining experience. It could have ruined my whole time. But we don't know. Maybe not. Right? So why not assume that everything happening around me is actually leading towards a positive outcome? There's actually no negative anyone can name to having that assumption. And yet there are many positives in terms of my experience, my effectiveness, and what I'm putting out to the world. That's changing how you fish for your spark of chokhmah. It's the most powerful thing we can learn to do. And you simply direct your consciousness there over and over again, and you suddenly find you can fish in different parts of the pond, catch different fish, row around to whatever part of the pond is most useful now, and you can broaden your perspectives, and you can take whatever your physical circumstances are and put all kinds of different frames of reference around them to have incredible positive effect on the entire structure around you. Yet some people
consistently get up on the wrong side of the bed, smash their heads into the wall of fear and doubt, and stumble anxiously through the day. Others face the same travails and interpret the same reality as an opportunity. Is one of them right and the other one wrong? Not empirically, but the criterion is health and well-being. Obviously, the latter attitude is miles ahead.
And let's do one more.
Kabbalah maintains that spiritual repose can be trained and mastered. You can learn how to reinterpret reality. You can draw upon and maintain a positive disposition by catching different fish, by metaphorically changing your fishing style. You can become a happier and more likable person and also profoundly alter the chemistry of your body. You can obliterate the old grooves of fear and form new tracks with new interpretations of old memories. Kabbalah even goes one step further. Joy and happiness are the soul's expression of its successful navigation of the sea of the body. The nerve endings, the cell receptors, and the billions of microscopic, even right down to the cellular level, are the channels for the soul's journey.
So that's the first step in the whole tree of life as it flows through consciousness. If you want to learn how to articulate all the different sefirot in the tree of life and to be much more mindful and positive about how we flow through, how a soul flows through a body, the first step is chokhmah. Because guess what? If I'm always going to that one little patch of mud in the pond and I'm saying this is going to be a negative experience, I'm going to fail, this is going to be scary, whatever my habit is, it's just a habit, then everything else that develops will come out of that spark of chokhmah. We have no other options. But we have a whole pond to fish in. Beautiful, beautiful other areas with beautiful depths and beautiful other fish and beautiful bait that we can use and beautiful other fishing equipment, whatever you want to say. And we can train ourselves to completely reinterpret the world around us so that every other attribute that we have can now have a different fish to deal with. And we can have a whole other experience through the whole tree of life that we're going to be learning about. Does that make sense? So in consciousness, as it flows in me, and that's the main model we're using, it's that first spark that seems to come out of a void. It's coming from a superconscious source, a higher part of our soul that I'm not conscious of. But that superconscious light or information has a way of getting through to my conscious mind. That way is chokhmah. It condenses down like a point. It flashes into my awareness. But because it's superconscious, it's light that I can't reach with my awareness. It has to come in an incomprehensible way. When it's there that moment, I don't know what it is. I need the second sefirah to actually learn about what's in it. And in moments after it happens, it's pulled open and it's explained and it's illuminated by my second intellectual sefirah, and that's the sefirah of Bina. But let's have a
quick question.
Yes.
When would that come to you?
Which?
The spark.
All the time. So it depends what quality of spark we're talking about. Perhaps I'm meeting somebody in a situation, and I suddenly realize there's something important about this person, and that's the first time I've met my future partner, and it's this huge revelation. I don't even know what it is, but I know something's different, and it's love at first sight, and suddenly I have all these feelings. So that's a major spark of chokhmah. But it could also be, where am I going to put this counter? I don't know. Oh, there's perfect, right? That's also a spark of chokhmah. So in big and small ways, this is flowing all the time. This is a constant flow of how divine light is revealing itself as my consciousness and your consciousness. So any realization of any appreciation of any aspect of reality is a spark of chokhmah.
How does this tie to being happy then?
Pardon me?
How does this tie to the idea of being joyful?
Well, it can also tie to being miserable if your spark of chokhmah is always, it's going to be horrible, right? So it doesn't necessarily tie to being happy. You have to choose to fish for the chokhmah spark in a way that will be most productive. So if I decide, I don't know whether this is for the worst or for the best, I'm going to assume it's for the best, and that's my chokhmah spark, suddenly I'm going to be more happy. It's my free will, right? The aspect of intellect that allows us to understand what's in chokhmah is Bina. Janelle, do we have this nice photo up there? Okay, again, it's just Adobe Art, so it's not all ones and zeros. We have 10 sefirot, don't worry about that. But there's much more going on in here. What before, for the gentleman, was just a spark of light that emerged, now has developed into almost a globe that's forming in many different figures and numbers and loops and information. That's the function of Bina. Bina forces open this spark of awareness, not awareness, the spark of insight, right? The English word we use for chokhmah is wisdom, which is tricky, but it's a spark of insight. The word we use in English for bina is often understanding. So this spark of chokhmah, to understand it, bina has to force it open, and then we start to see the details, right? Oh my God, this person's really cool. I'm gonna sit and talk to them. I wonder if we're gonna have a relationship, right? Whoa. Suddenly you realize what that spark was. Or, oh yeah, the counter goes there and it has to be this high and it has to, we gotta take out this piece, or whatever the situation is, right? Oh, the problem with this child is they need more attention, or they're spending too much time in front of the TV. Now I realize it. I realized it, now the details emerge. What does that mean they're spending too much time in front of the TV? How am I gonna deal with that? Spending too much time watching what? What is too much time, right? What's the best way to approach them? That's all bina, working out the details of the spark of chokhmah that emerged. Yeah, so Laibl, in his metaphor, if chokhmah is how we fish in our pond of consciousness for that spark of realization, bina is now how we cook that fish, right? Do we fry it? Do we broil it? Do we make a soup out of it? How do we spice it, right? So we're taking the raw fish and we're creating something that we can actually now serve or use or benefit from. Let's look a little more. We're in Practical Kabbalah, chapter 6, page 82. And where do we leave off? Go ahead. According
to widely acclaimed author and Dr. Deepak Chopra, we think about 100,000 thoughts a day, but about 95% of these are repeated day in and day out. Our mind climate seems to be both boring and inflexible. No wonder we feel ourselves replaying the same old record over and over.
Again, we tend to be creatures of habit. It's natural. I tend to have a certain way of analyzing things, and I'll just do the same thing with everything, right? Whatever old catfish chokhmah fish is, I'm just gonna man fry it. I just stick it on a plate and eat it, right? You know what that means, right? Just some oil and some heat and it's ready, right? Sorry, my apologies to any of you men who have culinary expertise, right? But there's many ways that we can analyze a situation, and we want to learn how to be more plastic, more flexible with bina, so that depending on the situation, depending on the spark of chokhmah, we can approach it from many different ways, categorize it in many different ways, bring out many different dimensions. And the more flexibility we can have, the more we can take that new spark of chokhmah and develop it so that it can be enjoyed as a meal, intellectually. Right? These are still our intellectual sefirot. And just to back up one moment, when we said that the spaceship of our body had two frequencies, I skipped over something, and that is there's a main distinction in the sefirot. There's one set that are intellectual, and then the rest are emotional and behavioral. Right? So what we're looking at, leave out keter for various reasons. We're looking today at chokhmah, bina, and hopefully dat. Those three are the intellectual sefirot. And by looking at them, we can learn how to reorganize and recategorize intellect as having three natural components, and that will allow us to have mastery over how they become emotional midot. So today I want to go through the intellectual, chokhmah being inspiration, now bina being cogitation, understanding. So my apologies for leaving that out. That's an important little piece. Right, let's go on page 82. Do you respond?
Do you respond the same way each time you are confronted by someone you dislike? Do you feel anger welling up inside you when you think about the occasion you felt humiliated? When budget issues arise, do you always become anxious? You often see people repeating the same mistakes at work and at home. Fear and insecurity carve out these grooves of habit. The key to creating change lies in recognizing these habits of the mind. The function of the sefira of bina is to take the creative spark of reinterpretation, the chokhmah, and redirect it into a new way of thinking.
Right, so chokhmah, to master chokhmah, we have to find a new way of being inspired, as it were. Up there, where I'm fishing around for that aha, it's not thought. I don't even know what it is. It's super conscious. I'm not aware of it. I actually can still direct it. My will can go up there and I can say, I want to be inspired this way rather than this way. I want to interpret this way rather than this way, but it's all above consciousness. Bina is the same retraining of habits and freeing of habits, but within intellect, within how can I think? What are my patterns of thought that develop into actual thought? What are the ways that I bring things out, put them together, remember them, store them, analyze them, etc. All of that, and it's infinite ways of even describing how one might think. All of that is Bina, right? It's a very, very complex Sphira. And going on.
The process of change from fixed responses to limited fears and inflexibility of mind requires our conscious involvement in the transition of thought sparks into the maturity of the Bina flow. If Chokmah is the way we draw on our source for inspiration and creativity of mind, Bina is the way that spark of inspiration becomes a cogent thought sequence. Chokmah fished for that thought. Bina cooks that fish.
Right, so, for instance, some people tend to be really oriented towards Chokmah and will have many, many creative insights and many great new ideas, many original thoughts, etc. But they may not be very strong in the Bina department. I see some people smiling there, right? But if I'm not strong in the B department, I may not even write them down and they're gone, right? I had so many great ideas last year and poof, right? Nothing happened to them. Other people are very Bina oriented. They may not be the most original thinkers, but when they get that thought, they can pull it apart, analyze it, make it something that's useful intellectually, so it can stick around and actually flow onwards in our consciousness. Ideally, we want to have both. So when required, we have to look into inspiration and say, okay, what's this about, what's needed here, and leave an empty space for Chokhmah to emerge. And no, you can't force Chokhmah, you can't think of it yourself, you can't rush it. Usually it happens when you stop wondering about the situation, it kind of pops out, not by accident, because it has to come out of a void. And then, if it's important, if that's a good spark of Chokhmah, now Bina goes to work. If I have both of them, now I can start to really be more impactful internally and for people around me. And finally, when you learn
Learn how to imbue your thought process with Bina. Thought becomes analytical, developed, and crystallized, and the process of self-refinement even more dramatic. Understanding replaces impatience. Energetic strategies for change replace anger. Instead of struggling to control life, you practice faith and acceptance. The Kabbalah literature calls this accomplishment. The insight of the heart.
Yeah, so if you're getting a picture, inspiration and cogitation, that's Chokhmah and Bina. And another model to how to look at them is, and this again, it's a metaphor not by accident, for many, many spiritual realities, is human reproduction. Right? We see often in Jewish texts, human reproduction is used as a model to teach us about spiritual worlds. And human reproduction flows as a metaphor exactly like Chokhmah and Bina, in that it has a male aspect and a female aspect. And if you look at this chart, male and female doesn't mean man and woman. It just means masculine pole and feminine pole. Everything has a masculine and a feminine pole itself. Everything relates to the rest of things around it, either as a masculine to a feminine or a feminine to masculine. So we're not using it as a gender, we're using it as a polarity. Right? So if everything flows out of the Ein Sof, each one of these sefirot is masculine to the ones below it and feminine to the ones above it. Right? So Bina is feminine compared to Chokhmah, but actually masculine compared to the rest below it. It's contributing them. Right? So seeing Chokhmah and Bina as a masculine-feminine pair, they function very much like human procreation. Chokhmah is a spark that flashes out that you don't understand, that you don't know what it is. You can't see the information in it at all. Well, what's the male contribution? It's a point. And you know, without an electron microscope, can you really see what the information is in there without getting the genes out of there and doing a, normally no, it's a point, I don't know what's in it. The female contribution is a whole structure that receives that point of information and forces it to expand and expand and expand and then differentiate. Okay, now you're going to be brain, you're going to be heart, more cells, differentiate again, you're going to be skin, you're going to be bone, nervous system, et cetera, until you get a whole structure out of this one point of potential. That point of potential, if it didn't enter into the feminine womb of Bina, would be completely lost. Nothing would come out of that potential. And yet, it had all the details of what would emerge once it entered into the womb of Bina to be forced open. But it's only once it enters that feminine container that those details can emerge and develop, and you can start to look and say, oh, this is a boy, it's a girl, it's this, it's that, right? And finally, you get a fully developed baby, and then we move on to the next stage. So in our minds, there's something going on all the time that's like human procreation. There's a spark of Chokhmah, and that spark needs to flow into the womb of Bina, and there it gets developed. And those are the first two components of intellect, and how we're going to try and understand ourselves as a soul flowing through a body from a Kabbalistic perspective. We talk a lot about frames of reference. It's amazing how frames of reference change. There was like an old timer that was talking to his grandson, and he said, in the old days, you could go to a store with a quarter and you could get yourself a loaf of bread, a dozen eggs, a watermelon, and a brand new bike. You can't do that anymore. Nope. Too many surveillance cameras. That's all a perspective, right? Now I got a ha-ha-ha. It's like you said ha-ha-ha. Was that any was funny or no? Okay. So we have just enough time to do dot. See, I guess this is the spot for like the you're the side guy.
I will be your side. I am Ed McMahon.
There you go. Well, you got a deal. Good.
Cantor, we don't have that, but I want to.
No, I didn't. Yeah.
It ends with does the Kabbalah count the accomplishment of Bina against the Chokhmah?
Reya Talev?
Yeah, the inside of the heart, and that sort of drew me to King Solomon, because the Torah says in the Book of Kings they say that King Solomon was wise.
Yeah.
And it was wise in his heart.
Yeah, in Judaism, the heart is actually, in many ways, the seat of wisdom.
Yeah.
And it's not as simple as we're saying. Although Chokhmah and Bina are intellectual processes we identify with the brain and thinking, actually the heart has a role in thought. And we're discovering that in neuroplasticity as well, that the heart has a brain. Oh yeah, and the gut too. Yeah, very, very beautiful.
Just a quick question. How long have you been studying?
I've been learning with Laibl about 4 years. So not very long, but enough to get fired up. Okay, so I didn't put the text for dot, but I hope we'd have time. Let me just fill in the third aspect of the intellect in the last 10, 15 minutes we have left. 6 minutes we have left. Can we go 10? Is anybody good with that? If you need to leave, I'll understand. Dot.
We have a next class.
Oh, okay, good. Dot is the third component of intellect, and it has two roles, and it's described as knowledge. Knowledge. So wisdom, understanding, and knowledge are the classic English words. Each one of them is such a red herring and so confusing and complicated, I would almost throw them out. Because what is knowledge in English? When you have knowledge about something, you have what? It's a collection of what? Information. Right? So I'm full of knowledge means I have a whole Rolodex of information in my mind. I have the knowledge, right? I've learned it. I've memorized it. That's knowledge. And dot has nothing to do with that. Nothing at all to do with that. It's the worst word to use.
Awareness or?
Awareness is closer.
Okay.
Again, how is dot used in the Torah and Genesis? The first time we hear it,
He knows Eve.
Adam knows Eve, right? In Hebrew, it's vayada. So knowledge is strangely used as intercourse, right? Sexual union. And believe me, the Torah is not shy about describing all kinds of graphic things. It wasn't to be cutesy that the Torah used the word knowledge to describe union. It's because that's what dot is. It's not a collection of information. It's connection to the information. Right? It's not a collection. It's a connection to the information. Make sense? Yeah. So when you have physical union with somebody, it's not that you go away and you say, oh, now I know this about them and that about them, and I know more about, I can put into a book the facts I've learned. There's something entirely else. You're joined, you're connected. Now you care about them. Now anything about them that happens affects you. There's billions of people in the world, but if it happens to this one person, now it's happening to me. I'm connected to this person. Dot is the capacity to connect personally to information. As well, it actually fulfills a role higher up. There's higher and lower dot. Higher dot actually has Chokhmah and Bina attracted to each other, so they're always entering. Chokhmah is always entering into Bina. Dat allows Chokhmah and Bina to be attracted to each other, which was your example at the beginning. When I walked into the kitchen, I knew I wanted something. I walked in and I forgot. What happened? Chokhmah retreated out of Bina. The spark was gone. Now Bina's like, what was I looking for? I don't know.
Yeah, and then it feels like a spark is back.
Yeah, so the problem is Dat was weak, and Dat did not keep Chokhmah spark in Bina. That's the focus element of Dat, where you can deeply focus on something, and the Chokhmah and Bina keep together, right? So what I do, I sit in the kitchen, I fire up Dat, that thing that you reach into to try and get it to reemerge. That's Dat getting Chokhmah and Bina attracted to each other, and now I remember, oh, I need the ketchup or whatever, right? That's actually a function of Dat. For our purposes, the more important function of Dat is that I connect to the information. That it's not just intellectual information that stays as inspiration and analysis, but cold intellect. But we now want to move to the emotional sefirot, which we'll learn about next week. And in order to feel emotions about something, Dat needs to connect it to those emotions, connect it to myself, and cause that energy to flow down into my emotional being. Because if it's just intellectual, I can sit and learn it all day, and my emotions will never flow. So there's a story we'll finish with that I heard on a video from the last master who was my teacher's teacher. This is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last master of this Kabbalistic tradition. And he taught in the name that he heard from a very, very old Chassid that heard from another very old Chassid named Reb Michael Berliner, of a story that he used to tell to his disciples, that in the old days they were yeshivnikas, they were these village Jews that had to move to villages just to make a living. So they moved to some remote village, maybe one or two families in each village. And over time, despite their tremendous piety and goodness, they became illiterate, these communities, and couldn't even read Aleph Bais, even with vowels. And so to train their kids, a few villages might hire one tutor, one Melamed, who would live in a central location, and they'd send their children to learn Aleph Bet and some Torah and some prayers. So one day, one of these yeshuvnikas, one of these villagers, received a letter. And unfortunately, he couldn't read the letter at all. Had no relationship to language. It meant nothing to him. So to understand it, he brought the letter to the Melamed, to the teacher. And of course, a little crowd gathered because this is an event. The letter arrives. The Melamed opens the letter. And the Melamed was a very learned person who could read Hebrew even without vowels, who understood everything on the letter, who could relate to it directly. And so the Melamed opened the letter and read it. And unfortunately, tragically, the letter informed the villager that his father had died. And when the villager got this terrible news, the villager fainted. And the Melamed calmly put the letter away and then helped the villager back to consciousness and comfort him. But then Michael Berliner asks, why is it that the villager fainted and not the teacher? The teacher was the one that directly read the letter. Why was the teacher not affected by that information? The villager who just heard the letter was the one who fainted. Exactly, right? It was the villager's father. The teacher was just reading the letter. So the difference between them is Dat, right? For the villager, Dat ignited, and that information was tragic, and the villager fainted. For the teacher, it was just intellectual, no Dat. Even though the teacher was the one that could relate to the Hebrew, had read the letter, should have been more affected, the teacher wasn't. Like for instance, again, if I hear that somebody in Michigan won $20 million in a lottery, that's nice information. I'm excited for that person. If I hear my wife won $1 million in a lottery, right, here we go, woo! Right? So information on its own does not equal emotions. Dat is that bridge which causes me to connect to emotions. Nothing to do with the knowledge. The package information, that's Bina, right? Dat is connection to it. And there's an even deeper message to get out of this story. We'll finish on that. And that is, it's easy to learn this stuff just out of a joy of learning. It's fascinating. It's wonderful. I hope you find it fascinating and not something else. But it's lovely to learn, and we can feel like we become expert, and we can feel like we can explain this stuff, and we become masters of this stuff, and we might have a wonderful time. But the Rebbe of this tradition said, when you're learning this, please don't ever read it as a letter about somebody else's father. Please don't ever read this as information about somebody else's father and you're just catching up with what's going on in heaven. Here's the news. Here's where the angels are stationed. Here's where the sefirot are. Here's where the cosmos flows into humanity. Woo! It's a lot of fun. You have to read this always about a letter about your own mother and your own father. Right?
Isn't that the same as in Haggadah when they say that you have to feel that you were the slave in Egypt that was brought out, not somebody else?
That's exactly the same. Very good. So if you didn't hear, isn't it the same in Haggadah? The Haggadah says, you must read this as if you yourselves came out of slavery, not somebody else, right? This isn't a story about some other people. This is a story about me. I was a slave and I was freed. Whoa, that's different, right? So please, I invite you, and help me as well as we go through this information, let none of this be a letter about somebody else's parent. This is always a letter about our parent. And we're the ones that should be fainting, and we're the ones that should be changing ourselves and moving and excited. And if we always have that element of dot, we'll see amazing things can happen in our emotional realms, and even more amazing things can happen in our behavioral realms as we move this into practice.
Is that empathy?
Yeah, empathy is very much involved in it. Yeah. But yes, let's leave it a yes. Okay. Thank you. Beautiful first class. Any questions? I'm hanging around, but feel free to take these home. And Yasher Koach. Bevakasha.
Well, I thought this would be easier.
So did I.
So did